My mother-in-law made the announcement at my father-in-law's 60th birthday party. Not a whisper, not a suggestion. A full announcement, in front of 32 people, with a champagne flute in her hand and a smile like she'd just done me a favor. "And, of course," she said, gesturing toward me across the dining room, "Sloan has agreed to back the expansion. Isn't that wonderful?" Everyone turned to look at me. I was holding a plate of bruschetta I hadn't touched. My husband was standing 3 feet away. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes on his mother and started to clap. 32 people started clapping. I stood there and smiled. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the context, and the context took me almost 4 years to fully understand. My name is Sloan. I'm 31. I'm a licensed CPA with my own small accounting practice, 12 clients when I started, 47 now. I built it from a converted second bedroom in the townhouse I bought at 27, before I married into a family that would spend the next 3 years quietly testing how much they could take before I noticed. My husband is Derek. We met at a conference in Atlanta, got engaged after 2 years, married in a small ceremony in Asheville. I loved him, genuinely loved him, and I went into that marriage believing his family would become mine. His mother, Barbara, his father, Gene, his sister Renee, and her husband Todd. The business is a home staging company called Holloway Home Group. Barbara started it 15 years ago, built it into something respectable. After Gene retired from his construction job, he became the operations manager, which mostly meant he handled vendor calls and told Barbara she was doing everything right. Renee came on board 4 years ago as the lead designer. Todd did some freelance photography for their listings. When Derek and I got married, Barbara mentioned, casually, over Sunday dinner, that she'd love for me to take a look at their books sometime. I said sure. I was being polite. I was new to the family and I wanted them to like me. That was my first mistake. 6 months later, I was their de facto CFO, unpaid, reviewing invoices every month, filing their quarterly taxes, and fielding calls from their vendor in Ohio who kept sending duplicate billing statements that nobody had caught for 2 years. I found $11,000 in overpayments in the first 3 months. Barbara thanked me with a gift card to Anthropology. I told myself it was fine. They were family. This is what family does. Derek said, "My mom really trusts you, you know. That means a lot to her." I took that as a compliment. I should have taken it as a warning. The expansion idea started coming up around the time their main competitor in the area closed. Barbara saw an opportunity to move into 2 new zip codes, hire 2 additional stagers, and lease a larger warehouse space for furniture inventory. On paper, it made sense. The market was there. The margins were good. The timing was reasonable. The problem was capital. They needed somewhere between $80,000 and $95,000 to do it right. New lease deposit, inventory, an additional cargo van, hiring and training costs, a small marketing push. Gene had a 401k he'd been contributing to for years, but pulling from it early would mean penalties and taxes that would eat a significant chunk. Barbara had savings, but not enough. The business line of credit they had was nearly maxed from a slow Q3. I knew all of this because I did their books. I also knew that my practice had a separate business account I'd been building deliberately and carefully since I opened. I'd never touched it for personal expenses. I used it for equipment, software, professional development, and a small emergency reserve. By that point, it held just over $90,000. I want to be clear, I never offered that money, not once. Not even as a casual, "we'll figure something out." I listened, I nodded, I gave them a realistic breakdown of their options. SBA loan, HELOC on their primary residence, bringing in a silent investor, or a phased expansion that spread the cost over 18 months. I presented all of it in a spreadsheet. I answered their questions. I did not volunteer my savings. But somewhere in that conversation, or in a conversation I wasn't part of, a different understanding took shape, one where Sloan's money was already on the table. The birthday party was a Saturday in October. Gene was turning 60 and Barbara had rented out the private dining room of the Italian place they'd been going to for 20 years. It was a genuinely nice evening. The food was good. The speeches were warm. Derek gave a toast that made his dad tear up. I sat next to Renee and we talked about whether she was going to repaint her kitchen, and for a couple of hours I almost forgot about the expansion conversation entirely. Then Barbara stood up. She'd had 2 glasses of wine and she was glowing the way she glows when she feels powerful, which is a particular kind of warm and expansive energy I had learned, by that point, to be cautious around. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about Gene's generosity, his work ethic, his steady presence. She told a story from when Derek and Renee were little that made everyone laugh. And then she said it. We have some exciting news as a family. Holloway Home Group is expanding into Westfield and Crescent Hills, and we couldn't be more thrilled. We've had so many blessings, and one of our biggest blessings is our daughter-in-law Sloan, who has agreed to back the expansion so this family can keep growing together. She looked at me and raised her glass. Everyone turned. Everyone raised their glasses. Derek started clapping. I smiled. I raised my glass. My face felt like a mask I was wearing over a completely different expression. I did not say no. I did not say anything. I have thought about that moment every single day since, and I've made peace with the fact that I froze. I was in a room full of people I'd spent 3 years trying to win over. My father-in-law was emotional and happy. My husband was clapping, saying, "Actually, that's not true," and that moment felt like setting the room on fire. I wasn't ready to do that yet, but I was taking notes. After the party, on the drive home, Derek reached over and put his hand on my knee and said, "Thank you for doing this. It means so much to them." I asked him when exactly he thought I had agreed to this. He said, "Mom mentioned you two had talked about it." I said, "We talked about their options." I gave them a spreadsheet. I never said I was funding it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I mean, you have the money." There it was. That sentence told me everything. Having money, to Derek and to his family, had somewhere along the way become the same thing as having agreed to spend it on them. I didn't fight with him that night. I said, "We'll talk about it this week." He seemed satisfied with that. He went to bed easy. I lay there for a long time. The next 2 weeks were a case study in how a family can apply pressure without ever quite saying what they're doing. Barbara called me on Tuesday to ask if I'd looked into the lease terms for the Westfield warehouse. I said I'd been busy. She said, "Of course, take your time," in a voice that implied I was already behind. Renee texted me a link to a cargo van listing with the message "Thoughts?" and 3 exclamation points. Todd, who I had maybe 20 real conversations with in 4 years, emailed me a sample investor agreement he'd found online and said Barbara thought it might be a good starting framework. Jim pulled me aside at Sunday dinner and told me this was a real chance to be part of something. He squeezed my shoulder. He smelled like Old Spice and sincerity. He meant every word, which somehow made it worse. Derek kept telling me how happy his parents were, how much this meant to them, how rare it is to find a daughter-in-law who's actually willing to invest in the family. I hadn't said yes, but the world they were living in had already moved past my yes. In that world, the money was already committed, the lease was already being drafted, and I was just a little slow on the paperwork. That's when I understood that I wasn't being asked. I was being managed. I was being managed. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters. For about 4 days, I considered doing it, not because I was convinced it was a good investment. I'd done their books long enough to know the margins were thin and Barbara made decisions emotionally. Not because I believed the family dynamic would improve. I'd watched what happened when people became financially enmeshed with Barbara, and it never ended with anyone's relationship intact. I considered it because I was tired. Because saying yes would have made Derek happy and made Sunday dinners easier and meant I didn't have to have the conversation that I could see coming from miles away. I know what it costs to be the person who says no in a family where no one else does. I considered it for 4 days. Then I stopped. What stopped me was a specific memory. About 8 months into my marriage, Derek and I had a fight. Not a big one, not a marriage-threatening one, just a normal, frustrating fight about how much time we were spending with his family versus building our own life. At one point, he said, "You knew what you were getting into when you married me." I'd let it go at the time. But lying in bed at night thinking about $90,000 in a business I didn't believe in, that sentence came back to me. You knew what you were getting into. No, I hadn't known. And I wasn't willing to keep pretending otherwise. I'm a CPA. I build structures for a living. I know how to do things correctly, and I know how to do them in the right order. Over the following 10 days, quietly and without mentioning it to Derek, I did several things. I transferred the funds from my business reserve account into a new account at a different bank, one that was in my name only and that Derek had no visibility into. This wasn't hidden money. It was always my separate property, earned before our marriage, kept in a business account he'd never had access to. I was simply moving it somewhere cleaner. I called my attorney, a woman named Constance, who I've worked with since I opened my practice, and told her I was making some structural changes and needed her advice. She listened to the full situation. She said, "How long has this been going on?" I told her. She said, "Okay, let's talk about what clean looks like." What clean looked like was this. I formally resigned my role, such as it was, as the unofficial accountant for Holloway Home Group. I drafted a letter. Constance reviewed it. It documented what I had done for the business over 3 years, confirmed it had been performed informally and without compensation, and stated clearly that I was no longer available for bookkeeping, tax preparation, financial advising, or any other professional services on behalf of the business. I kept it completely professional, no emotion, no accusations. I also identified the financial records I had stored on my personal laptop and organized copies for them. All of it was theirs. I'd never claimed otherwise. But I was going to make sure the handoff was clean and documented, because I already knew this family would later claim I'd left them with nothing. I was ready. I chose a Sunday. I chose Sunday because Sunday dinners were the weekly ritual, the setting where the family operated as a unit, where announcements were made and expectations were reinforced. I'd watched Barbara use that table as a stage my entire marriage. I figured it deserved to be the setting for this too. I arrived a little early and helped set the table, the way I always did. Barbara was in the kitchen making her pot roast. Jean was watching football. Renee and Todd came in around 5. Derek poured everyone drinks. We sat down. Jean said grace. Everyone started eating. Barbara asked me, somewhere around the salad, whether I'd been in touch with the commercial real estate agent about the Westfield property. I said, actually, that's what I want to talk to everyone about tonight. Everyone looked up. I had thought about exactly how to say this. Not emotionally, not accusatory. Clean, like a business conversation, because that's what it was. I said that I wanted to address what Barbara announced at Jean's party because I didn't want there to be any confusion going forward. I said that I had never agreed to fund the expansion. I said that the conversation we had was me presenting options I'd outlined in a spreadsheet, and that funding it personally was not one of those options. I said I was glad to have helped identify the overpayments and manage the books over the past 3 years, and that I genuinely wished Holloway Home Group well, but that I was formally stepping back from any informal financial role in the business effective immediately. I slid an envelope across the table to Barbara. The letter, signed, with Constance's name on the letterhead as the attorney who'd reviewed it. Then I said, I've also organized all the financial records on my laptop. I can transfer everything to you this week. I want to make sure you have everything you need to bring on a professional. The table was completely silent. Barbara looked at the envelope. She didn't open it. Jean said, quietly, Sloan. Renee said, what is this? Derek said nothing. He was looking at his plate. What happened next I will try to describe as honestly as I can because it wasn't simple and I don't want to make it sound like it was. Barbara cried. Not immediately. First she was very still and then she said slowly, I don't understand, we're family, and then she cried. And I sat there and I didn't say I'm sorry because I wasn't, but I didn't say anything cold either. I just let her cry. Jean said I was taking this too far. He said he thought we were all on the same page. I told him I understood he believed that and that I was sorry there had been a miscommunication, but that I had never been on that page. Renee said something about how I'd basically been part of the business for years and this felt like a betrayal. I said I'd been helping informally as a family member and that I was now clarifying that that arrangement was over. Todd said nothing. Todd never says anything. Derek finally looked up and said, Can we talk about this privately? I said, I'm happy to talk about this privately, but I needed to say it here because the original announcement was made here in front of the same people. That landed. Barbara looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. I had more to say, but I didn't say it. I'd prepared for the possibility of a longer argument. Constance had helped me think through responses to various scenarios. But looking at that table, at Barbara's red eyes and Jean's confusion and Derek's silence, I understood that I'd already said what needed to be said. Anything more would have been for me, not for the situation. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the plates, the way I always did. Then Derek and I drove home. The next 6 weeks were the hardest of my marriage. Derek was not immediately on my side. That's the honest version. He felt caught between his family and his wife, and his default was to manage me rather than address them. He said I'd ambushed his parents. He said I could have handled it less dramatically. He said that his mother was just excited and didn't mean any harm. I told him his mother made a financial commitment on my behalf without asking me in front of 30 people and that nothing about that was just excitement. We went to couples therapy. That was Derek's suggestion, actually, which I respected. In those sessions, some things came out that I think both of us needed to hear. Derek acknowledged that he had known about his mother's announcement before the party. He'd been told, vaguely, that I was on board, and he hadn't asked me directly whether that was true. He admitted that was a failure on his part. Barbara wrote me a letter. 2 pages, handwritten, which I read carefully and kept. She didn't apologize exactly. It was more of a, I see now that there was a misunderstanding and I'm sorry it caused hurt feelings kind of letter, which is a specific kind of not quite apology that I've come to recognize. But she wrote it. She made the effort. I acknowledged it. Holloway Home Group ended up not expanding into Westfield. They found a different accountant, a retired CPA named someone I'd never met, and he apparently told them the same thing I would have told them, which was that the timing wasn't right and the capital wasn't there. The expansion was tabled. The business kept running. It didn't collapse. That part matters to me. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was trying to stop something that would have hurt me, and possibly them, and almost certainly us. Derek and I are still married. I want to say that not as a triumphant statement, but as a factual one. We did real work. The therapy was uncomfortable and necessary, and I still think about some of those conversations. I don't know if Derek fully understands what it cost me to be in that family for 3 years, carrying the weight of their financial uncertainty while pretending I was just a helpful daughter-in-law. I hope someday he does. Sunday dinners are different now. We go less often. When we do go, I am friendly. I help set the table. I do not talk about money. Barbara doesn't ask me about the books. Gene tells me about his golf game. Renee and I talk about her kitchen renovation, which she still hasn't started. My practice has grown since then. I have a real bookkeeper now, a 26-year-old named, well, that's her business. I finally updated my equipment and put $30,000 of that reserve toward a second office space I've been planning for 2 years. The money went where I always intended it to go. I think about that moment in the restaurant sometimes. Barbara raising her glass, 32 people turning to look at me, standing there with a plate of untouched bruschetta, smiling at a version of my life that I had never agreed to. I should have said something right then. I know that. Every comment on the internet will tell you that, and they're not wrong. I should have said it down clearly, right there in front of everyone. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed to do it right. I needed to do it in a way that was documented and clean and couldn't be twisted later into something else. I needed to be the person in the room who was absolutely certain of her ground before she opened her mouth. And when I was ready, I did. That's the version of the story I'm at peace with, not the version where I was perfectly brave in the right moment. The version where I waited until I knew exactly what I was doing, and then I did it completely. I used to think the hardest part of standing up for yourself was finding the courage. I don't think that anymore. The hardest part is accepting that the people who pushed you to that point genuinely didn't see it coming, and that their surprise doesn't make you wrong. Barbara wasn't a villain, in the way stories usually need villains to be. She didn't sit down and plot against me. She just operated in a world where the people who loved her rearranged themselves around what she needed, and she'd been doing it long enough that it felt like the natural order of things. By the time I came into that family, the expectation was already built in. You contribute. You don't make it complicated. You find a way. What she didn't account for was that I'd spent my entire adult life building something deliberately. The practice, the savings, the careful, unglamorous work of creating financial stability on my own terms before anyone else had a claim on it. That $90,000 wasn't a windfall. It was years of saying no to things I wanted so I could say yes to things that mattered. When Barbara raised that champagne glass and made her announcement, she wasn't just assuming my money. She was assuming my years. I think about what would have happened if I'd said yes. And I don't just mean the money, I mean the version of myself I would have become. Someone who funds a business she doesn't believe in, managed by a woman who'd already shown me exactly how she makes decisions, in a dynamic where my value was measured entirely by what I was willing to hand over. I would have resented every month of it. And I would have resented Derek for not stopping it, and eventually the marriage would have rotted from the inside, quietly, in a way neither of us would have been able to name clearly until it was too late. Actions accumulate. The pattern Barbara set up over 3 years, the unpaid work, the quiet pressure, the assumption that my professional skills were a family resource, that didn't happen in one moment. It happened in dozens of small moments where I told myself it wasn't worth the friction. Every time I filed their quarterly taxes without a word. Every time I caught a billing error and fixed it and moved on. I was teaching them, without meaning to, that there was no line. That was on me too, and I've sat with that honestly. What I know now is that intelligence without the willingness to act on it is just information. I understood what was happening to me for a long time before I did anything about it. The knowing wasn't enough. What finally moved me was deciding that my own life was worth protecting with the same care I'd always given to everyone else's finances. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Sloane made a choice on a Sunday evening, at a table she'd set dozens of times in front of people she'd spent years trying to fit herself around. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She handed over a letter and told the truth, plainly, and then she finished her dinner. That's the whole thing, really. You don't always get the dramatic moment. Sometimes it's just a quiet dinner where you finally say what's true and you sit with the discomfort of having said it and you go home and you don't apologize. That's what it looks like to finally choose yourself.